Chapter 1. The Girl in the Mud. Dylan had always been the kind of man who found comfort in solitude. For years, he had chosen isolation over companionship, finding solace in the barren stretches of Avloris, a harsh and unforgiving planet located on the fringe of known space. It was a place where the winds howled across cracked earth, where nothing seemed to grow except sparse desert shrubs, and where the vast expanse of sky stretched above in every direction, offering nothing but emptiness. The landscape mirrored Dylan's internal state perfectly: wide, empty, and unforgiving. His cabin, a small, rudimentary structure built from salvaged materials, stood like a lone sentinel at the edge of a massive canyon, far away from the nearest settlement. It wasn't a place that invited visitors, not unless they had something or someone to escape from. Dylan had left everything behind years ago, finding the peace he craved in the isolation of this remote world. It was his escape, his way of shutting out the remnants of a past that he was desperate to forget. The planet was sparsely populated, and the people who did make their way to Avloris were often transient. Miners, exiles, or travelers who had lost their way, looking for anything that might offer a respite from whatever had driven them out into the barren wasteland. Dylan didn't have to deal with them, though. The closest settlement, a small mining town by the name of Garan's Hold, was at least a full day's journey by land across treacherous terrain, which made the place ideal for someone like him. In the years that had passed, Dylan had grown accustomed to the lonely routine of his life. He woke early, worked on the cabin, collected what little supplies the land provided, and spent the evenings sitting by the fire, reading old books or simply watching the stars. Life on Avloris was simple, unremarkable, and just the way Dylan liked it. He had everything he needed to survive, and that was all that mattered. There was no need for anyone else in his life, no need for interaction beyond the occasional trade trip into the town for fuel and other essentials. It wasn't much of a life, but it was his, and that was enough. For a moment, he thought it might just be a passing windstorm, the kind that sometimes whipped up suddenly and sent the desert into a frenzy. But then, he saw it, a figure in the distance, silhouetted against the fading light. Dylan squinted, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. It wasn't a person, not at first glance. It was too small, too strange. But it moved, and it moved with a kind of jerky, disoriented motion, as though it were struggling to make its way across the uneven terrain. Dylan's hand tightened on the rifle, but he didn't raise it. Whoever or whatever this was, it was far too far away to pose an immediate threat. He watched for a few more moments, unsure whether to approach or not. It could be a traveler, someone who had gotten lost in the harsh desert. Or it could be something else entirely, something far less human. As the figure drew closer, Dylan's heart skipped a beat. It was a woman, or at least, that was what he first thought. She was covered in mud and dust, her clothing ragged and torn, barely clinging to her emaciated frame. Her skin, though marred with dirt, had an ethereal, pale hue to it, unlike anything Dylan had seen before. She was alien, unmistakably so, though her features were soft and almost human in shape. But it was her eyes that caught his attention. Despite the dirt and grime covering her face, her eyes wide, luminous, and bright shone with an intensity that sent a chill through Dylan's spine. They were the eyes of someone who had seen far more than they should have, someone who had suffered, and someone who had endured. The girl stumbled again, her legs buckling beneath her, and she collapsed onto the dusty ground with a soft thud. Dylan didn't hesitate this time. He dropped the rifle and rushed forward, his heart pounding in his chest. As he reached her, he knelt down and immediately checked for signs of life. The girl was breathing, shallow but steady, and though she was covered in mud, dirt, and scratches, there was no sign of serious injury. Her delicate form was fragile, like something that had been left to decay for far too long, yet the faintest pulse of life still flickered within her. Dylan hesitated for only a moment before gently lifting her, cradling her small, alien form in his arms. She weighed almost nothing, as though her body had been emptied of everything but the barest essence of life. He carried her back to the cabin, his mind racing with questions he had no answers to. Inside the cabin, Dylan laid her down on his bed, brushing aside the tangled, mud-caked hair from her face. He moved quickly, his hands trembling slightly as he searched for water and supplies. He had no idea what she was or where she came from, but instinct told him that he needed to help her. As he began to clean her up, gently wiping the grime from her face and arms, he was struck by the delicate beauty of her features. She was unlike any alien species he had seen in the few encounters he had had with travelers on Valoris. There was something otherworldly about her, something almost mystical in the way her skin seemed to shimmer faintly in the low light of the cabin. He continued to clean her, his mind struggling to make sense of what was happening. Who was she? Why was she here? What had brought her to the edge of death in this isolated corner of the universe? These questions churned in his mind as he worked, but his primary focus remained on her, on making sure she was safe. As he gently wiped away the mud from her face, he felt a strange connection to her, an unexplainable pull that made his heart ache. She was fragile, vulnerable, and somehow completely alone. And in that moment, Dylan realized that he wasn't just cleaning her up. He was doing something far deeper, something he didn't fully understand. He was caring for her, as if she were his own responsibility now. Her eyes fluttered open suddenly, the deep, alien pupils gazing up at him with a mix of confusion and fear. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, Dylan, still in shock from the surreal nature of it all, and the girl, whose expression seemed to soften as she looked at him. There was something ancient in her gaze, something that spoke of pain and survival, of something far greater than anything Dylan had ever known. Who are you?" she whispered, her voice raspy and weak, yet carrying an air of authority that belied her fragile state. Dylan opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. He couldn't form an answer that would explain how impossible this moment felt, how this fragile alien girl had changed everything in an instant. All he could do was look at her, and the only words that came were the simplest ones he could muster. "I don't know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm here now." The moment the girl's eyes met Dylan's, everything about the world seemed to shift. There was something about her gaze, something ancient and unspoken, that unsettled him to his core. It wasn't just that she was an alien, something foreign and unknown. It was the sheer intensity of her presence. Despite her fragility, despite the layers of grime and dirt that caked her small form, there was an unmistakable strength in the way she looked at him. As though, even in her weakened state, she still carried the weight of something far beyond herself. Something otherworldly. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she slowly propped herself up on the bed, her limbs trembling with each movement. Her delicate fingers, covered in mud, hovered above her chest for a brief moment before she struggled to sit upright fully, her gaze locked on him. Dylan, still unsure of what to do, stepped back a few paces, giving her space but never taking his eyes off her. "Where am I?" Her voice was soft, and it was clear she was exhausted, her words coming out in fragmented gasps as if speaking was an effort. She looked around the small, dimly lit cabin, confusion clouding her features. For a fleeting moment, Dylan almost wondered if she was from a distant world, one where beings were so different that they were not even capable of understanding basic human interactions. But as the silence stretched on, he saw something else in her eyes. A hunger, a thirst for knowledge, or perhaps something more. The kind of thirst only those who had been lost, truly lost, could have. And in that moment, Dylan knew he couldn't turn away. He couldn't leave her to whatever fate had been waiting for her out there, in the dust and the heat of the planet. "You're on Valoris," Dylan said softly, his voice carrying the weight of uncertainty, of the questions that were too big to answer. "I found you out there, out in the canyon. You were covered in mud, barely alive." The girl's eyes flickered at his words, her gaze shifting as if trying to piece together the fragmented memories of her arrival. The past seemed distant to her, as though her mind had been clouded by something, perhaps an injury, or the harsh conditions she had endured. She winced slightly, her hand lifting to her forehead, as if trying to grasp the remnants of her scattered thoughts. It was evident that she was in no state to understand everything just yet, and even Dylan wasn't sure how much she would remember once she fully recovered. What had she been doing on this barren planet, alone, in such a condition? Why had she been abandoned here, miles away from civilization? These questions burned in the back of his mind, but now, all he could focus on was making sure she was stable. "Do you remember anything?" Dylan asked gently, crouching beside the bed. He could see her trying to recall something, anything, from the depths of her fading memory, but the effort was visible. It seemed like a struggle to even process what he had just said. Her eyes, once sharp and intelligent, seemed lost in the haze of her fatigue. I don't know," she whispered, her voice thin and strained. "I remember, light, and then cold. And then nothing. Dylan's heart ached at her words, knowing that whatever had happened to her had been far beyond anything he could comprehend. It was clear now that she wasn't just a random traveler stranded on this forsaken planet. No, there was something about her, something deeply unsettling in the way she spoke, in the way she moved. She wasn't just any alien. She was different, and whatever she had experienced, it had left her with a story that Dylan was only beginning to understand. As he continued to clean her up, carefully removing the layers of mud and grime from her body, Dylan noticed that her skin, though pale and almost translucent, shimmered faintly under the light. Her body was slight, fragile, but there was a beauty to her that transcended her alien nature. It wasn't just physical. It was something deeper, something that spoke of a world far away, of a place where beings like her were capable of more than just surviving. They were capable of greatness. Dylan had no idea who she was, but it felt as if she was meant for something more, something bigger than the dirt he was scrubbing off her body. The more he cleaned her, the more he saw. Her hair, once matted and tangled with dirt, began to shine with a silvery luster. Her eyes, still wide and luminous, seemed to glow faintly in the dim cabin light. Her body, though weak and malnourished, still carried the elegance of something ancient. She was not of this world, not of any world he could name. And as he wiped away the last remnants of mud from her face, he couldn't help but wonder, what had happened to her? Who had abandoned her here? What was she running from? The girl's breathing had steadied by the time Dylan finished cleaning her up, though her exhaustion was still evident in the way her body sagged against the pillow. She closed her eyes for a moment, as if trying to summon the energy to speak, and then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she asked, "Why did you help me?" Dylan paused. It was a simple question, but it cut to the heart of everything. Why had he helped her? There were so many answers he could give. He could say it was because she was a living being, deserving of help. He could say it was because she was vulnerable, and he couldn't stand to see anyone suffer. But deep down, he knew that the truth was far more complex. Something about her had drawn him in, something beyond mere pity or obligation. She wasn't just a creature in need of rescue. She was a piece of a puzzle he hadn't known existed, and the moment he laid eyes on her, the entire course of his life had changed. "I don't really know," Dylan admitted, his voice quiet and tinged with uncertainty. "I saw you out there, alone, and I couldn't just leave you. He stopped himself, suddenly unsure of how to continue. The truth was, there were no simple answers, no neat explanations. He had acted on impulse, without thinking, without knowing why. "I just couldn't leave you out there." Her eyes opened again, and for the first time, they seemed to soften as she met his gaze. It was almost as if she understood something he wasn't ready to acknowledge. She shifted slightly in the bed, her delicate alien fingers brushing against his hand as she spoke again. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of gratitude that was both unfamiliar and humbling. "You don't know what you've done." Chapter 2, A New Beginning. Dylan didn't sleep that night. He sat by the fire in the corner of the cabin, staring at the flickering flames as they danced and swayed, casting shadows across the walls. His mind was racing, the events of the past few hours replaying in his thoughts over and over. He had rescued an alien girl, a being unlike anything he had ever seen before, and brought her back to his cabin, to his sanctuary. He had been thrust into a world that was completely foreign to him, a world full of questions, of mysteries that he couldn't yet begin to understand. His thoughts kept returning to her eyes, those luminous, almost otherworldly eyes that seemed to carry the weight of an entire existence in their gaze. She wasn't just a victim of circumstance. She wasn't just some lost traveler. She was different. She had a purpose, an aura around her that made Dylan feel as if he had stumbled into something far beyond his control. The truth of it was undeniable. His quiet, solitary life on Valoris had ended the moment he found her. As the hours passed, and the cabin grew quieter, Dylan heard the soft sound of movement from the other room. He turned his head, his eyes flicking to the doorway. There, standing in the frame of the entrance, was the girl. Her appearance had changed. She had bathed, and though her alien features were still unfamiliar, she looked more like a person than a lost soul. She had wrapped herself in a blanket Dylan had found in his storage, her hair still damp, but now shining with an ethereal silver glow. She looked at him, her gaze steady, and for the first time, Dylan saw the vulnerability in her eyes. She wasn't just a mystery anymore. She was a person, and somehow, she had changed him. "I feel better," she said, her voice soft but clear. I think I can stand on my own now. Dylan nodded, his eyes lingering on her as she took a tentative step into the room. Her movement was graceful despite the exhaustion that still clung to her. It was as if she had been reborn in the space of a few hours. And yet, Dylan knew that she was far from healed. He wanted to ask her so many questions. What had happened to her? Where did she come from? Why had she been abandoned on this planet? But he knew that it wasn't the time for those questions. For now, she was safe. That was all that mattered. For a moment, they stood in silence, both unsure of what to say next. And then, without warning, she spoke again. My name is Eloria, she said, her voice steady now, though it was clear she still carried the weight of some unspoken burden. I have nowhere else to go. But you saved me. And I don't know what that means yet, but I want to stay. Dylan didn't hesitate. The words he had been too afraid to say spilled out before he could stop them. You're safe here, he said, his voice firm with conviction. You're safe here with me. Eloria sat down slowly on the small wooden chair by the table, her movements still hesitant, as though the fragility of her body wasn't quite reconciled with the energy in her eyes. She looked around the room, taking in the sparse furnishings and the dim light of the fire that flickered in the corner, casting long shadows across the cabin's walls. It wasn't much, but it was warm, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she seemed to find some comfort in the simple surroundings. Dylan noticed this, and for reasons he couldn't fully explain, it made him feel oddly protective. The girl, this strange, alien creature who had appeared out of nowhere, covered in mud, seemingly abandoned, was beginning to recover, but it was clear that her physical condition wasn't the only thing that needed healing. There was something in her eyes, something deeper than the visible exhaustion, something that hinted at loss, at a pain far greater than anything he had ever known. Thank you, Eloria said softly, looking at him from across the room, her voice steadying with each word. For everything. Dylan looked up from the fire, meeting her gaze, and though he felt an overwhelming need to question her, to demand answers, something about her calmness made him hesitate. She wasn't just a lost alien, a being to be studied or questioned. She was a person who had been through something unimaginable, and he couldn't shake the sense that he was being asked to play a role in something far larger than himself. He had never been much for responsibility. His time as a soldier had left him disillusioned with causes and battles that felt meaningless. But this was different. He had no answers, and he wasn't sure how to proceed, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He couldn't turn his back on her. You're welcome, Dylan finally replied, his voice softer than usual, the words flowing from him with a sincerity he hadn't expected. He stood up and moved toward the small table, the weight of his own thoughts pressing in on him. But you've been through a lot. I don't know what you're running from, but you're safe now. That's what matters. Eloria didn't answer right away. Her eyes seemed lost in some distant memory, her fingers absently tracing the edges of the blanket she had wrapped around herself. It was clear she was grappling with something, trying to piece together her fractured thoughts. Dylan could only imagine the kind of terror and confusion she must have experienced in whatever place she had come from. He wasn't sure if it was something physical, a wound to the head, or a trauma that caused her memory to slip, or if it was the kind of emotional weight that left its mark on the soul. Either way, it was clear she wasn't going to be able to move forward until she understood her own past, until she understood who she was again. I don't know where I am, Eloria murmured after a long pause, her voice carrying a sadness that filled the space between them. I don't remember much of anything, only fragments, glimpses of light, of noise, of pain, and then nothing. Her voice faltered as she closed her eyes, a shudder running through her fragile frame. I was lost, in a place that felt endless, and I couldn't escape. Dylan's heart ached at the rawness in her voice. He had never known true fear like the kind Eloria described, but he could feel the terror she had experienced. He didn't know what kind of life she had lived before arriving on Avloris, but it was clear it had been anything but kind. And now, here she was, stranded on a remote world with nothing but the remnants of a life she could barely remember. Dylan wasn't sure how to help her piece the pieces together, but he was starting to realize that he had been drawn into her story. Somehow, despite everything, he couldn't walk away. You're not alone, Dylan said quietly, sitting down across from her, his eyes softening as he spoke. Whatever happened, you're safe here. You can stay as long as you need. We'll figure it out, together. Eloria's eyes flickered up to meet his again, this time with something different, something that looked like relief, though she still seemed lost in her own thoughts. It was a small thing, but it made Dylan feel as though he was starting to understand her, even if only a little bit. She was not the alien she had seemed when he first found her. She was a person, a living, breathing being with a past, and though that past was still shrouded in mystery, he couldn't help but want to help her unravel it. But there was something else, something in the back of his mind that gnawed at him. There was more to this situation than a simple case of a lost traveler needing help. He could feel it deep within him, an unsettling sense that Eloria wasn't just any alien. There was something powerful about her, something that didn't belong here, on this barren, forsaken world. Dylan didn't understand it, but he knew that helping Eloria, truly helping her, would not be as simple as providing shelter and care. There were forces at play here, things far beyond the scope of his life on Avloris. He couldn't help but wonder, was she running from something? Was someone or something after her? Chapter 3. The Truth in the Stars. The days that followed were a blur of quiet moments and unspoken questions. Eloria's condition gradually improved, though her memory remained fragmented. She couldn't remember how she had come to Avloris, nor why she had been abandoned in the mud of the canyon, but her physical health began to stabilize. She started eating more, her energy returning in small increments. But despite her growing strength, something in her eyes remained distant, haunted even. She would often stare out the small cabin window, gazing at the distant horizon, lost in thoughts that Dylan couldn't reach. The silence between them was never uncomfortable, but it was thick with unsaid words, with the questions that hung like a fog in the air. Dylan had never been good with people, not really. His time as a soldier had made him wary of attachments, wary of opening up to anyone who might eventually leave. But with Eloria, something about her made him feel as though he couldn't keep his distance. There was a pull between them, a quiet connection that both frightened and fascinated him. He wanted to help her, more than he cared to admit, but there was something inside him telling him that helping her wouldn't be so simple. One night, as they sat by the fire, Eloria finally spoke, her voice low and hesitant. "I remember something," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I remember being taken from somewhere I don't know. And then darkness. I was trapped." She paused, her eyes closing as she seemed to struggle to piece together the fragments. "There was something chasing me. Something not human." Dylan's breath caught in his throat. He had been expecting something like this, but hearing it from her own lips made the reality of the situation sink in. She was being hunted. Whatever had happened to her before she arrived on Avloris, whoever or whatever she had been running from was still out there. And now, Dylan was involved. He had never thought his life would take such a turn, but now, there was no turning back. What were they? Who were they? Dylan asked, his voice steady, though his heart raced. He had to know. He needed answers. Eloria shook her head, her face twisted in frustration. "I don't know. They were shadows. But not just shadows. They were hunters. They wanted something from me. But I don't know what." Dylan clenched his fists, his mind racing. He had heard of stories of alien forces, of beings who could slip through shadows, of organizations that hunted across the stars. But none of it had seemed real. Not until now. Now, with Eloria sitting across from him, looking at him with those wide, haunted eyes, the threat felt far more real. "Stay here," Dylan said, his voice firm, the protective instinct rising within him. "You don't need to worry. I'll make sure you're safe. Whatever's after you, it won't get you." Eloria looked at him, her expression softening, her features still worn from whatever nightmare she had come from. She reached out, her delicate hand resting on his arm as she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you," she said. "You don't know what this means." And as Dylan looked into her eyes, he realized that he didn't need to know everything. He didn't need to understand all of it. He only needed to know that he couldn't turn away. He had already chosen to help her. And now, there was no going back. Dylan spent the following days in a haze of uncertainty and action. He knew he couldn't sit idly by while Eloria, this alien girl, was still in danger. The brief moments of quiet in the cabin only deepened the feeling that something far larger than either of them was unfolding, something Dylan couldn't yet fully grasp but could feel in his bones. The more time he spent with her, the more he noticed the strange gaps in her memories, the way she would occasionally flinch or withdraw, as though the very act of recalling her past caused her pain. He began to see that it wasn't just physical recovery she needed, it was the unraveling of her past, and whatever had led her to this place. And in the midst of all this, Dylan was caught in the current of something that felt inevitable. The days bled into one another, marked by quiet conversations by the fire and slow progress as Eloria regained her strength. Her health continued to improve, though she still wasn't quite the same. There was a strength to her now, but it was tempered by something deeper, something she kept hidden beneath the surface, behind those eyes that seemed to carry the weight of an entire universe. It was the weight of loss, of abandonment, of things Dylan couldn't possibly understand. Yet, with every passing day, he became more certain that his life had irrevocably changed. The quiet life he had known, hidden away on Avloris, had been forever altered by the moment he found her. The moment their paths crossed. One evening, as the wind howled through the canyon outside, a new thought took root in Dylan's mind. The longer Eloria stayed with him, the more likely it became that whoever or whatever was after her would eventually find their way to him. Avloris wasn't the most populated planet in the galaxy, but it wasn't entirely devoid of traffic either. The small mining settlements and trade routes ensured that people came and went, and sooner or later, word would spread of a mysterious girl being taken in by a reclusive man. And with that, would come the search, the relentless pursuit of something, or someone, that neither Dylan nor Eloria fully understood. He couldn't keep her hidden forever. He had to make a plan. Dylan was seated by the fire again that night, the crackling flames casting shadows against the walls of the cabin, when Eloria joined him. She had been pacing around the cabin for the past hour, clearly agitated. Dylan noticed that she looked different tonight, more focused, less lost. It was the first time in days that she seemed to be more than just a girl recovering from a traumatic event. She was thinking again, her mind clearly working on something. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, the tension mounting as they both faced the uncertainty of what came next. Eloria sat down across from him, her eyes meeting his with a quiet intensity that made Dylan's pulse quicken. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The crackle of the fire was the only sound in the room. Finally, Eloria broke the silence, her voice low and steady. "I remember something more now," she said, her words weighing heavily in the space between them. "I don't know why it's coming back to me, but I remember. I was part of something. A group. I don't know what they were called, but I was trained, kept in isolation, prepared for something. Something terrible. And then there was the escape. The journey here. The pursuit." She closed her eyes, her brow furrowing as if the memories were too painful to process. "I was meant to be something more, Dylan. I was supposed to lead. But they took everything from me." Dylan felt a chill run down his spine at her words. She had been trained for something, prepared for something. And now, it seemed like whatever had happened to her was catching up with her. She wasn't just a lost soul. She was a target, someone whose existence was tied to something much larger and far more dangerous than Dylan had originally thought. He had known she was different, but now he was beginning to understand the depth of the danger she faced. "What are you saying?" Dylan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He couldn't bring himself to believe the words, not fully. How could someone like her, so fragile, so vulnerable, have been part of something so dangerous? She had been so lost when he found her, so helpless. The pieces weren't fitting together. "What did they want with you?" "I was part of a lineage," Eloria said, her voice quiet but filled with a strange kind of resolve. "A bloodline. My father was a leader, part of a faction that believed in something that could change the galaxy. But his enemies, those who wanted power for themselves, destroyed everything. They tried to kill me. And then, they left me for dead. I've been running ever since." The weight of her confession hung in the air. Eloria wasn't just some stranded traveler. She was someone with a history, a legacy that others wanted to erase. And Dylan, by helping her, had unknowingly placed himself in the middle of a galactic power struggle he had no way of comprehending. A struggle that seemed to involve forces far beyond the quiet desert planet they were on. He didn't know what was coming next, but he knew one thing. He couldn't just stand by and let her face it alone. "You can't stay here, Eloria," Dylan said, the words coming out more urgently than he intended. "They'll find you. They'll find us. I don't know who they are or what they want, but I can see it in your eyes. This isn't over. It's only just beginning." "I know," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly as the weight of the truth finally hit her. "But I have nowhere else to go. And if I stay, I'll be putting you in danger too. I don't want that. You've helped me so much already." "You're not alone in this," Dylan said, a fire igniting in his chest, one he hadn't felt in years. "I don't care what they want. I'm not letting them take you. She looked at him, her eyes shining with something he hadn't seen before: gratitude, but also something deeper. Something that suggested that, despite the fear and pain in her past, there was hope. A new beginning. Then we leave, she said softly, her voice gaining strength. We leave this place before they can find us. And we go somewhere they won't look. Somewhere we can start over. Dylan's heart raced. He had never expected this. Never anticipated his quiet life on Valoris to be turned upside down by someone so mysterious, so powerful in ways he couldn't even begin to understand. But there was no going back now. They were both in this together. He had to protect her no matter the cost. Chapter 4. Into the Unknown. Dylan spent the next few days preparing for the unknown. There was no turning back now. He couldn't stay on Valoris. The danger was real, and whatever it was that was after Eloria was closing in. He didn't know who or what was hunting her, but the tension in the air was thick with an impending sense of urgency. He had packed what little supplies he could carry, gathered his few weapons, and prepared the small transport ship he kept for emergencies. It wasn't much a single-person vessel that could carry them off-world, but it would have to do. His life, as it was over. But something in him had shifted. He couldn't go back to living in isolation, not with her. She had become more than just someone he was helping. She had become someone he couldn't abandon. Eloria was ready. She had regained enough strength to stand and walk without assistance. And though she still seemed haunted by her past, her resolve had strengthened. She had chosen to leave. She had chosen to trust Dylan. And in that trust, he found something that ignited a determination he hadn't known he still had. They were in this together now. And there was no turning back. As they lifted off from the surface of Valoris, leaving the barren desert behind, Dylan felt a strange sense of finality. The stars outside the viewport stretched out before them like a dark ocean, infinite and full of possibilities. But the road ahead was uncertain. Whatever was chasing Eloria, whatever enemies she had, they were out there, waiting for her. And now, they were coming for him too. Dylan glanced at Eloria, who sat across from him, her eyes focused on the stars, her face a mixture of anticipation and fear. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel alone. They were both running from something, but they were also running towards something new, something better. He couldn't say what it was yet, but he felt it in his bones. The galaxy was vast, and there was always a chance to start over. For now, they had each other, and that was enough. As the small transport ship soared through the endless stretches of space, the hum of the engines was a constant reminder of their flight from Valoris, of everything they had left behind. Dylan sat at the helm, hands steady on the controls, his eyes flicking between the blinking instruments and the stars stretching out before them. He had no clear destination in mind. The galaxy was vast, and they were small, insignificant in comparison. But the uncertainty of it all didn't overwhelm him as it might have once done. Instead, it filled him with a strange sense of freedom, the kind he hadn't felt in years. They were no longer bound to the desolate, dust-choked planet they had just left behind. The air in the cabin felt lighter now, even as the shadow of danger loomed over them. They were free. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, they were free to decide what came next. Eloria sat in the small seat next to him, her eyes glued to the viewport, watching the stars streak past them as the ship accelerated into deeper space. Her face was calm, though Dylan could sense the underlying tension in her posture. She hadn't spoken much since they left Valoris, and he wasn't sure if it was because she was simply tired or if there were deeper, more painful thoughts she was unwilling to share just yet. Either way, the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was a quiet understanding, a mutual agreement that both of them were stepping into the unknown together. There were still so many unanswered questions about Eloria, about her past, and about the enemies that pursued her, but for now, there was only this moment. "Do you ever feel like you're running away from something?" Eloria asked suddenly, her voice soft but filled with an intensity that caught Dylan off guard. He glanced at her, finding her gaze fixed on him, though her eyes seemed distant, as though she were searching for something beyond the cabin walls. "Or maybe, you're running towards something?" she continued, her voice trembling slightly, the weight of her own words seeming to surprise her. "I never thought I would have a chance to escape. I didn't think I could ever leave. But now, for the first time, I feel like I'm free. But it's like I'm still running. Like something is chasing me, even out here, far from the world I knew. But maybe I'm running towards something too." Dylan felt a lump form in his throat as he absorbed her words. He had never considered himself a philosopher or someone prone to deep reflections, but in that moment, as the vastness of space stretched out before them, he understood what she was trying to say. She was running from her past, from something terrible that had followed her across the stars. But she was also running towards something she hadn't quite named yet, a hope, perhaps, or a possibility that had once seemed impossible. He didn't know exactly what that was, but he could feel it in her, this quiet but determined sense of purpose that stirred within her like a dormant seed waiting for the right moment to sprout. "I think we're both running," Dylan replied after a long moment, his voice steady, but laced with something deeper, something raw. "But we're not just running away. We're running towards something, Eloria. Toward a new beginning. I don't know what it is, or where it will take us, but I'm not going to stop running." She turned to him then, her eyes softening as she met his gaze. The flickering light from the stars outside cast an ethereal glow on her face, making her seem almost otherworldly, like a vision from another time. And yet, in that moment, Dylan realized something profound. She wasn't just a mysterious alien running from her past. She was human, in a way that transcended her physical appearance. She was someone who had been shaped by pain, by fear, but also by resilience. And he could see, now more than ever, that her journey was his journey, and it was one they would face together. The silence between them deepened, but it was no longer filled with uncertainty. It was the kind of silence that spoke of understanding, of shared experience, and the quiet bond that had been forged between them in the brief time they had spent together. Dylan wasn't sure how long it had been since they left of Loris, but the stars outside felt different now, closer, more tangible, as though they were no longer isolated in the void of space, but moving towards something. Maybe it was the sense of freedom that had taken root in his heart, or maybe it was the knowledge that Eloria wasn't alone anymore. But whatever it was, it gave him strength. It gave him hope. "Thank you," Eloria whispered after a long pause, her voice soft and full of emotion. "For everything. You didn't have to help me, but you did. And I don't know why, but I trust you. I trust that wherever we go next, we'll be okay." Dylan looked at her, his heart swelling with an emotion he hadn't expected. He wasn't sure how much longer they could stay hidden from whatever was chasing her, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let her face it alone. He had already chosen a path, and he would walk it with her, no matter where it led. "I don't need you to thank me," Dylan said softly, his voice steady with quiet determination. "I'm not doing this for you to thank me. I'm doing this because I want to. Because I believe in you, Eloria. And because, for the first time in a long time, I believe in something more than just surviving. I believe in living." The words hung in the air between them, a promise that bound them together, whether they fully understood it yet or not. Eloria's face softened as she looked at him, her eyes reflecting something deeper now, something filled with gratitude and shared purpose. She nodded slowly, her lips curling into a faint but genuine smile that Dylan found himself returning without thinking. For a while, neither of them spoke. The stars outside continued to streak past, endless and infinite, and the hum of the ship became a comforting presence in the quiet cabin. Dylan continued to guide the ship through the vast expanse of space, knowing that the road ahead would be difficult. They weren't safe yet. The danger was still out there, lurking in the dark corners of the galaxy, waiting to find them. But for now, in this moment, they had each other. And that was enough. As the hours stretched into the night, Eloria finally leaned back in her seat, her body exhausted from the emotional toll of their conversation. Dylan glanced at her, noticing the weariness that had returned to her features. She still had a long way to go, both physically and mentally, but she was stronger than she had been when he found her. And she wasn't alone anymore. The thought brought a strange peace to his heart, one he hadn't known he was looking for. "Where are we going?" Eloria asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper as the ship sped through the darkness. Dylan took a deep breath, looking out at the endless sea of stars. There were 1,000 places they could go, 1,000 systems they could hide in. But he knew in his heart that it didn't matter where they ended up. It was the journey that mattered, the chance for them to create something new. And in that moment, Dylan made a decision. He didn't need to have all the answers. He didn't need to know what the future held. All he needed was to keep moving forward. For Eloria, for himself, and for whatever new life they could build together. "I don't know yet," Dylan replied, his voice steady and filled with the quiet certainty that had settled over him. "But wherever it is, we'll find it together."